What new configuration of the world order will emerge out of the Polycrisis? Many scenarios have been imagined or predicted, including 3 spheres of influence dominated by the world's superpowers, a new global order imposed by Trump's Board of Peace, rule by a global kleptocracy, fragmentation of the world order into another world war, global depression, runaway inflation or stagflation, small or large wars spilling into nuclear holocaust. Some of these may be plausible hypotheses, but in the context of the Polycrisis, all such hypotheses about possible futures are highly speculative. For example, after the U.S. decapitation strike of Venezuela, speculation was rife about a new world based on spheres of influence, but that ignored the vast economic power of China and Latin America, and it was rapidly followed by U.S. bombings in countries around the world and its claims on Greenland. Even though each such speculation may be somewhat plausible, none of them has much chance of establishing itself before it is destabilized by others. The forces of chaos are at this point sufficient to undermine the best laid plans of mice and men. So the most likely outcome is an ongoing struggle among desperate forces, none of which is likely to oppose its will on the world. As Adam Tooze put it, we're not even in an interregnum because an interregnum implies another regnum afterward. Call it Polycrisis 2.0. Polycrisis is inhospitable to many forms of social change intended to create a better world, like national or global reform, national or world revolution, or even conventional coalitions. There are several reasons for this. The weakening or breakdown of multilateral forums for global cooperation like the UN and many others eliminate the main means through which governments have cooperated in pursuit of common interests and values. However detrimentally great power leadership was exercised, abandonment of leadership by great powers leaves a vacuum that is not easy to fill. The problem of amassing enough power to impose an alternative structure at any level is daunting. Multiple forms of fragmentation and chaotic, unpredictable conditions impede construction of stable coalitions and alliances. And overcoming the Polycrisis requires not just overcoming an oppressive power through resistance, but also overcoming disorder through new forms of cooperation. On the other hand, the breakdown of the pre-Polycrisis world has some benefits. The strength of the great powers, and especially the US, to dictate to the rest of the world has been significantly diminished. While they may have powers to destroy, their ability to shape outcomes is more questionable. For example, consider the failures of the Trump administration to block trade deals among other countries or to halt green tech initiatives outside the US. While large-scale global transformation is difficult to envision in the context of the Polycrisis, there are some objectives that might be realized at least in part. First is simply self-protection of the vulnerable. This can be seen in the scramble of many countries to form multiple trading and other relations in the face of tariff and other attacks. A second is harm reduction. For example, most countries outside the US have continued their efforts at climate protection in spite of fierce opposition from the Trump administration. Third, although the Polycrisis impedes cooperative planning for the future, it is possible to build formal or informal bases that can serve as launching points for cooperation and restraint of destruction. For example, the International Solar Alliance, initiated in the lead up to the Paris Climate Summit by India with support from France, initially signed up 15 nations to accelerate fossil-free energy production in the developing world. This has become an alliance of 120 nations using their joint purchasing power to cut the price they pay for solar production. Polycrisis 2.0 exhibits several overlapping possibilities that might help the Polycrisis. In response to the rise of great power rivalry, aggravated by Trump's aggressive use of tariffs, countries around the world have been rapidly moving toward polyalignment, building multiple relationships in multiple spheres and at multiple levels. This is exemplified by new deals between Canada and China, and between the EU and India. Ravinder Kaur, writing in The Guardian, says that, while initially focused on trade, the overarching EU-India comprehensive strategic agenda is really much larger in scope, taking in defense and security, commitments to multilateralism, mobility, and cooperation in a range of areas. It remains to be seen whether such multiple alignments will generate wider cooperation rather than new rivalries. A widely noted speech by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, declaring that the old world order was facing not a transition, but a rupture, called for an alliance of intermediate powers to build a new order that encompasses our values, such as respect for human rights, sustainable development, solidarity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the various states. He argued that the middle powers must act together. He said that to help solve global problems, Canada is pursuing variable geometry. In other words, different coalitions for different issues based on common values and interests. That is creating a dense web of connections across trade, investment, and culture. He noted that in the past few days, Canada has concluded new strategic partnerships with China and Qatar, and is negotiating free trade pacts with India, ASEAN, Thailand, Philippines, and Mercosur. The potential of intermediate powers to discipline the great powers in the polycrisis as a whole remains to be seen. Where specific aspects of the polycrisis can be isolated, coalitions can be organized to force cooperation or block actions augmenting destruction. For example, in January 2025, Bolivia, Colombia, Cuba, Honduras, Malaysia, Namibia, and South Africa joined to form the Hague Group to coordinate legal and diplomatic measures in solidarity with the Palestinian people. In July 2025, it convened 30 governments for an emergency conference on Palestine, which unanimously agreed that the era of impunity must end, and that international law must be enforced without fear or favor through immediate domestic policies and legislation. 12 of the participating states committed to implementing 6 measures to end their complicity with Israel's genocide of Palestinians, such as preventing the provision of weapons, military equipment, and dual-use items to Israel, including ending the transit of any such materials to their territories or transport on any ships bearing their country's flags. Unexpected breakthroughs are making energy produced by sun, wind, and water cheaper, safer, and more efficient than energy produced by fossil fuels. This is already transforming the way the world produces and uses energy, and it will further transform economics, politics, and society. This is a global revolution, but it has so far been largely driven by China's huge advances and investments in green tech, technology that reduces or repairs harm to the environment. Green tech includes ways of producing energy like solar and wind power, ways of distributing it in time and space like energy storage and energy grids, and ways of using it like EVs and carbon-neutral buildings. Countries and people around the world are producing and installing green tech. In 2024, renewables worldwide made up 92% of all new electricity capacity additions. In the first 6 months of 2025, the world added 380 gigawatts of new solar capacity, 64% higher than the 232 gigawatts installed during the same period in 2024. The necessities of climate protection, combined with the opportunities presented by a fossil-free energy system, could create a global dynamic with forms of cooperation that transcend the polycrisis. In Polycrisis 2.0, social movements are developing to challenge governments that are perpetuating and augmenting war, authoritarianism, plutocracy, kleptocracy, environmental destruction, and other elements of the polycrisis. A dramatic example is the mass popular opposition that has developed to authoritarian rule in the US. It has ranged from the 7 million strong No King's Day protests to the street-level resistance to ICE attacks on American cities. Such movements represent challenges not only to parafascism and the destruction of democracy, but to the warmongering and obliteration of international cooperation they promote. Their successful opposition to Trump and Trump-style rulers around the world is a first condition for quelling the polycrisis. Quelling the polycrisis will ultimately require coordinated worldwide action by the world's people to impose cooperation on the battling power centers that are threatening life on Earth. A prime example is the movement to support the Palestinian people against Israel's genocidal attacks. Nearly 48,000 demonstrations in 137 countries and territories were held globally in the 2 years following the start of the genocide in Gaza. In Europe, dock workers refused to load weapons for Israel. In Italy, millions participated in 2 general strikes and demonstrations for Palestinian rights. Such global social movements can play a crucial role in quelling the polycrisis. International linkages are developing that can augment them. For example, an international anti-fascist and anti-imperialist conference is scheduled in Porto Alegre, Brazil in March, called by signatories from more than 50 countries. And the Permanent Assembly Against the War brings together immigrants, workers, and activists from across Eastern and Western Europe, including both Ukraine and Russia, to organize for a transnational politics of peace. Such transnational linking organizations can help open a pathway to pacification of the polycrisis. There are obviously contradictions among these varied forces, but that does not make their cooperation impossible, especially in the face of devastating threats. The challenge is how to navigate those contradictions to begin to quell the polycrisis. The chaotic nature of the polycrisis makes it fruitless to offer a plan or program to establish another regnum. The guidelines presented here simply offer perspective on how to begin to move beyond the polycrisis. First, recognize, align with, and support common human interests. They include the human rights of all people, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, the conditions of our Earth and its climate that make our life possible, the constitutional principle that government must be accountable to law, global cooperation to provide a secure future for our people and planet, and our ability to live together in our communities, our countries, and our world. While people, institutions, and nations inevitably will act in pursuit of limited short-term goals, we must make them do so in ways that advance rather than undermining common human interests. Otherwise, they will only aggravate the polycrisis and bring further ruin to their own people. Second, construct patchworks that bring together diverse actors across common interests. A fascinating study of international cooperation in times of polycrisis describes patchworks as patches or islands of creativity and reconfiguration, forming in nodes or knots of assemblages across time and space. One example given by the study is the International Solar Alliance. Another is the High Ambition Coalition, initiated by the Marshall Islands, which play the role of global bridge builder for a coalition that straddled negotiating blocs organized around traditional north-south lines to demand stronger climate agreements. It significantly influenced the content of the Paris Climate Agreement. The fragmenting world of the polycrisis opens up spaces for patchworks and other collective initiatives and may make it harder for anyone powered to destroy them. The notion of patchworks can encourage creativity and bring together diverse movements, institutions, and countries to impose partial pacifications of the polycrisis. Third, use patchworks to establish new practices of global cooperation. This involves reconstituting the UN and the 60-plus organizations for international cooperation that the Trump administration has recently quit, expanding their missions and power through coalitions of the willing. When that provides elusive, a shadow UN and similar alternative vehicles can temporarily fill in. If patchworks invent new forms of cooperation, those can be expanded to develop new international institutions and practices to start quelling the polycrisis. In the words of Ray Atchison of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, building transnational networks of mutual aid, collaborative campaigns, and political education are going to be a key part of building a new world order.